each person may have his or her own unique way of practicing the 4 skills because each has different strength. Good morning everyone, I am Jasmine Abelyon together with my partner Jihani Gonzalez. And in this morning, we are going to talk about Sternberg's successful intelligence theory and the WICS model. But first, let us talk about its proponent. So the proponent of this theory was Robert Jeffrey Sternberg. He was an American psychologist who currently works as a professor at Cornell University. Sternberg did a very extensive work in the field of intelligence because as a youngster, he had a difficulty with intelligence tests. He did not perform well in such tests, and this might have fueled his interest in the field of intelligence that led him to come up with triachic theory of intelligence in the 1980s. And over the years, his theory evolved from a more complex or complicated componential triachic theory to a simpler, successful intelligence theory. And more recently, in collaboration with other prominent psychologists, Sternberg proposed the WICS model, which stands for the wisdom, intelligence, creativity, and synthesis. And now, successful intelligence theory has 4 skills, which includes the memory skills, analytical skills, creative skills, and practical skills. So, the memory skills helps a person to recall the facts or pieces of information. It also helps us retain the knowledge we acquire. And the second skill is the analytical skills. It helps a person to determine if a certain idea is good. And the third skill is the creative skill. So, this skill allows a person to come up with a new idea, usually to answer a need and to solve a problem. It also makes one flexible and able to adjust to changes in one's situation. And the last skill is practical skill. It enables a person to apply what one has learned, and it also allows one to carry through or implement a plan. And according to Sternberg, successful intelligence is the ability to succeed in life, given one's own goals, within one's environmental context. It is maximizing one's own strength, not only to adapt to one's environment, but to also contribute significantly to society. So, in the WICS model, the intelligence is viewed as a set of fluid abilities to learn from our experiences and to adapt to one's surroundings. Also, WICS is a more recent model that helps us understand how students will learn most effectively. And as what I have said earlier, WICS model stands for wisdom, intelligence, creativity, and synthesis. And Sternberg described the WICS model as follows: that the basic idea is that the citizen of the world need creativity to form a vision to where they want to go and to cope with the changes in the environment. Analytical intelligence, to ascertain whether their creative ideas are good ones. Practical intelligence, to implement their ideas and to persuade others of the values of their ideas. And wisdom, in order to ensure that the ideas will help achieve some ethical-based common good over long-term and short-term, rather than just what is good for themselves and their family and friends. Your role as a teacher is not just to educate the mind alone, but to educate the soul as well. In my own perception, Sternberg presents a very relevant model which states that a leader with intelligence should lead with passion. Sternberg also proposed that while education develop analytical and practical intelligence as well as creativity, wisdom should be an integral part of the whole process.
Okay, so let us proceed on applying the WICS model. So the uses of the WICS model include these following: admission and instruction and assessment. But in our module, we will only focus on instructional assessment. So one way that you can apply WICS model is when you reflect and make choices of the task and activities that you will give to teach and assess your students. You may choose to teach analytically, creatively, practically, as well as teach for wisdom. So Sternberg described each of these. Okay, so let us explain first on how to teach analytically. So how do you teach analytically? So make your students use critical thinking, design tasks and activities that provide opportunity for learners to, the first one is analyze. So for example, you will give an activity that analyze the development of the character of Ibarra in Nolimi Tangere. So that's an example of analyzation. So the second one is critique. For example, you will give them an activity that critique the design and features of the latest smartphone. And number 3, judge. For example, judge the artistic merits of Filipino cartoonist Larry Alcala's Slice of Life. Okay, so the next one is compare and contrast. So as a teacher, you will give them an activity that should compare and contrast. For example, compare and contrast the Italian approaches of Montessori and Reggio Emilia in early childhood education. That's an example of compare and contrast. Next is evaluate. For example, evaluate the validity, the theory of evolution. So that's an example. And then the next one, the last one is the assess. So another example is assess the strategy of the Manila City government to improve this traffic situation around the city. So that's an example on how to do or how you teach analytically. Now let us proceed on how do you teach creatively. So it is important for you to encourage and sustain your students' creative ideas. Remember to be an example to them by taking the risk to share your own creative ideas. Think of the box. Design tasks and activities that help students to, number 1, create, invent, discover, imagine if, suppose that, and the last one is predict. Okay, so the first one there is create. For example, create an alternative ending to Florante at Laura. So that's an example that will cope the creativity of your students. The second one is invent. For example, invent a dialogue that would transpire if Jose Rizal and Ninoy Aquino met. Okay, so the third one is discover. For example, discover a way to explain why heavy ships float at sea. So that's a science. Next is imagine. For example, imagine if the EDSA revolution did not happen in 1986. What do you think our country will be like at present and 10 years later? So the next one is suppose that. For example, suppose that you were to design a computer game to help children learn about love and sacrifice. Describe the game you will create. So the last one is predict. Predict changes that will happen if humans had a third eye at the back of their heads. Choose an appliance or gadget that would need to be changed in order to be useful. Okay, now let us proceed on how do you teach practically. So have in mind real-life situation where students can use what they learn to meet their own and also others' practical needs. So design tasks and activities that allow your students to, number 1, apply, use, put into practice, implement, employ, and the last one is render practical what they know. Okay, so let's have first the apply. So for example, you will give an activity that would apply. For example, apply addition concept in determining number of boys and girls in the classroom. Next one is use. For example, use the knowledge of Excel to keep track of daily household expenses. So the third one is put into practice. For example, put into practice what you learn about classroom rules in making your own classroom rules poster. Next is implement. For example, implement a lesson plan that one has made. Then we have employ. For example, employ the formula of computing the area of one's living room to determine the number of 12 by 12 tiles needed to cover the floor. And the last one is render practical what they know. For example, render practical a proposed assembly design for a computer PC. Now we have here how to teach for wisdom, or how do you teach for wisdom. So one of the goals is for learners to learn to see and understand the point of view of others. It is important for your learners to balance one's own needs with the needs of other people, and also of the world or the environment. It is developing your learners to consistently act based on positive ethical values. Okay, so you can teach wisdom, or you teach for wisdom when you are able to move your students to try to find a common good. For example, what might be a solution for the common good in the Philippines and China claim on Spratly Islands? So the second one is see things from others' points of view. For example, think of a person you had a conflict or fight with. Put yourself in that person's place. Write down her point of view and concerns as detailed as possible. What can you do or say to express that you understand the person now? So that's an example for the second way or to teach wisdom. So number 3 is balance your own interest with those of others and of institutions. For example, should parents expect their children to take care of them when they are old? Why? So that's an example of number 3. Okay, so next is look at the long term as well as the short term. For example, how is global warming going to affect the world and the Philippines in particular? What can you do? And the 5th one is reflect about how one can base his every decision on positive ethical values. For example, is it ever ethical to shoot down a plane with civilians and terrorists on board if the terrorists plan to slam the plane to a building with thousands of people? And the last one is appreciate that in life what is seen as true and effective may vary over time and place. For example, how does parenting change over time? What would you say are different now than before? What are the constant things that should be present to make the parent-child relationship work? So those were the examples on how to teach, or how do you teach wisdom. But always remember that you can teach wisdom if you can move your students with the following examples.
The WICS model has been used not only for instruction but also for admission and assessment. Sternberg and his colleagues proposed, tried out and studied creative ways of doing student admission as well as assessing students' learning.
So based on their studies, the WICS model was successful for teachers and their learners because it celebrated the differences of learners through a supportive learning environment. Second, it made students remember better than they learn. And next, build on the strengths of the learners. And the last one is strengthen the motivations of the learners.